Hello, and welcome to a Crate and Crowbar lock-in. I'm Jamie Britton, and with me today is Marsh Davies.
Hello.
And we're going to be talking about, because of overwhelming public demand, two movies, one of which is 72 years old and the other one that's 80 years old. Namely, Rebecca from 1940, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, and Brighton Rock from 1948. Yeah, so we were just sort of talking in the Crate and Crowbar planning Discord channel about possible topics for discussion, and I was kind of suggesting that there's a slight gap in the market maybe for people talking about older movies. And I'm not someone who is necessarily one of those dudes who can reel off, if you ask me my top 10 favorite movies, I'm probably not gonna say much that's before 1970 or around then. I tend to think that modern movies are a bit more consistent, really. But there's a couple of movies that I just really, really adore, and Rebecca in particular was a movie from my childhood where I was just kind of I saw it, we had it on video, I watched it, and I didn't know that black and white movies could be as good as it turned out to be. And so I just thought we could have a chat about it and see what comes up.
I'm really glad that you picked these two movies, Jamie. I think I like the idea that these are sort of like a cinematic serving suggestion. They are kind of mirrors of each other in a lot of ways, and also both kind of the same time, but also quite telling of that time in cinema history. I can't wait to dig into it. But so why did you pick this pair of films?
I guess they're interesting to me because they're both British. They both were made during the war period, 1940 for one, 1948 for the other one, when, the war was over, but, it's still very much the mindset of the time. They both have a sort of fixation on British culture in a funny kind of way that is both, they're very different, but also, I don't know, they have a sort of similar horror/social commentary vibe that I just find kind of fascinating. I mean, I guess British people are always going to be obsessed with class and manners, and both of these movies are kind of about that in their own weird way.
Yeah.
And they've also got a fair bit of violence in them, one way or another. There's moments in both of these movies which are quite, disinhibited and brutal. And, I mean, maybe it's just nostalgia, but when I was a kid, watching Rebecca, I mean, when the twist came in Rebecca, which we'll get to, but when the twist came in that movie, I was so shocked by it. I didn't see it coming, and it completely knocked me on my ass. I was so surprised by the revelation that comes, 2/3 of the way through the movie. And I, at the time, I didn't know an old movie could do that. I thought only The Usual Suspects could do that, or something like that. So I think there's something about the kind of Hitchcockiness of it, which is also really, interesting. And similarly with Brighton Rock, it's just kind of, I watched it. I can't remember when I first watched it. I had it on DVD for some reason on a horrible, grimy copy. I'm very pleased that the version that you can watch now, that's out and about, is much nicer and much cleaner. The version I had looked like it had been, videoed off ITV in like 1980 or something. But it's just an unusual movie. It's a gangster movie set in Brighton. It's got the guy from Jurassic Park in it. It's kind of, which obviously is, one of my favorite movies. Everyone's favorite movie. Gives you a bit of an in there. So yeah, that's kind of, I don't know why they're so linked in my head, but they are.
I would never have put them together before your suggestion to do so, but having watched them back to back, there's loads of ways in which they kind of intersect with each other. But we'll get to that. I suppose we should say that both of these films are available. They're both available on YouTube, actually, at 720p. The presentation of them isn't kind of like horribly compressed or anything, so it's pretty watchable in both cases. But we are going to spoil both of these films completely and utterly, so you may wish to watch them before coming back to this podcast.
So let's start with Rebecca, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. It was his first movie made with kind of American money, made with David O. Selznick. There's a documentary about the making of the movie, which I'll pop in the show notes, which is mostly, in fact, almost entirely concerned with the relationship between Hitchcock and Selznick. Selznick was he was making this movie at the same time he was making Gone with the Wind, which is so stressful. There's anecdotes told in that documentary about him being on amphetamines and B12 injections and having secretaries take dictation at 3 a.m, and he would literally just pass out. That's how his day's work would end. He would just pass out where he stood. And they contrast that with Hitchcock, who would just have a stiff drink and go to bed. But it's kind of an interesting, I mean, it's a funny documentary really, because it's all like golden age Hollywood weirdos who are always a particular breed of strange, kind of musing, reverently about these guys. But yeah, it's kind of it's fascinating because the film is kind of seen as this kind of meeting of the grand producer. David O. Selznick had made Gone with the Wind, and he was he didn't direct that movie. He had a series of directors who he bullied and drove insane throughout the course of filming, but he was very much of the old style that a producer could make a movie. And Hitchcock obviously became the sort of foundational figure for auteur theory. And there's lots of excellent stories about him driving O. Selznick crazy by not shooting coverage, i.e. not shooting all the other stuff in a scene that you need, reverse shots and wides and things like that. He only shot the stuff that he was going to put in the movie, which to this day drives, my experienced television producers crazy, because it always makes me think of like Superhands from Peep Show would do, where it's just like, no, just nail it on the day. It's that kind of pantsing it attitude. The fact is that the movie did very well and was very well considered, and I think was kind of Hitchcock's passport to Hollywood. When I first saw it, I didn't really know who Hitchcock was particularly. The film didn't strike me as particularly Hitchcocky, although watching it again since, it's pretty Hitchcocky. Briefly, it is adapted from the Daphne du Maurier novel, which is also excellent, and which this movie is a pretty faithful adaptation of the same name, which is a kind of gothic romance about a young, beautiful woman who takes up with a dashing, mysterious aristocrat with a temper, and goes to his beautiful house, and learns that there was a previous wife, the first Mrs. De Winter, the Rebecca of the novel, who holds sort of all of the place and the people there under a kind of spell. And it's about her kind of discovery of who that person was and what that means to her. I think there's this kind of there's this notion in Gothic romance, and actually just romance in general. I remember learning about this at university, whereas this idea of like, and you see this in you see it in almost every Mills and Boon novel. You see it in like sexy books like your 50 Shades of Grey and stuff like that, and you also see it in stuff like Jane Austen. It's this idea, say a scene where a woman is carrying a big pile of books, and then a man comes past her, and she looks at the man, and she drops all the books everywhere, and she has to scrabble around on the floor to pick up the books, and she looks at the man's face, and he's looking at her with what she assumes to be anger and rage and contempt for her. And then as the novel kind of comes to a climax, it turns out that in that moment, he wasn't feeling that. He was overcome with her beauty. And it is this reoccurring sort of theme that happens again and again and again in so many books that kind of fall under the idea of romance. And I think that one thing Rebecca does really, really well is it kind of starts there, but where it ends up is it starts in that kind of old idea that women are unaware of their own beauty and unaware of their kind of place in the world, and then takes it somewhere kind of much creepier and much more unusual than I think you've seen before. It manages to be a Gothic romance that is also a comment on Gothic romances as well. Sort of postmodern take on those things.
Yeah, it's such a film of whiplash contrast in a way, because it begins with this sort of light-hearted almost thrill of their romance in Monte Carlo, and the light, the landscape, sea, sand, and sun, and then it gives away to these shadowy interiors and the starchy manners of this potentially haunted manor, and then that ghostliness is then punctured almost entirely, and the thing pivots again into being a sort of legal thriller. And then there's a denouement, which not even readers of the book would have expected. It's not really just one thing. I think that's one of the things that makes it feel so much fresher than you might expect of a film of that era. Like you were saying, I too have probably some fairly shameful prejudices against films of this period, and I find there's a sort of a bit of a hurdle getting over some of the sort of the mannerisms, and actually getting over Hitchcock's particular way of pacing shots, partly as a result of his refusal to shoot around dialogue, because he never wanted to give editors or the studios the kind of rope to hang themselves with. He didn't want to have too much material so that they couldn't fiddle with what he wanted. As a result, you get these quite sort of truncated bursts of dialogue that feel slightly kind of juddering and jarring, presumably because there was no natural flow to the conversation that the actors were having, because he was just shooting whoever was in the camera frame and then stopping them. So you have to sort of overcome those issues as somebody who finds favor with modern cinema and modern cinematic conventions. But then it's easy to do that with Rebecca because it's such a kind of incredibly pacey, thrilling belter of a film. And that's one of the kind of weird things about Hollywood, Hitchcock, is that he's elevated as being one of these sort of auteurs, but actually that kind of status doesn't come with any kind of sobriety or deep reverence necessarily. He makes very populist, very exciting, and entertaining films, I think, and I don't find that Rebecca is that inaccessible as far as movies of that era go. It's quite a ride.
I agree. Although I would say one of the main barriers for me in movies from this era is the music. It's always kind of very, very samey scores that I just...
Yeah.
Hollywood couldn't get rid of those quickly enough, and it took them so long to work out they could put pop music in the movies and stuff like that. And it's just kind of... I always find that's a little bit tricky. I mean, the score in this movie is perfectly nice and perfectly serviceable, but it, like almost every movie, it is a kind of orchestral, almost like pastiche, romantic, music kind of vibe, which is, whatever.
Yeah, it doesn't mean anything to me, which is strange. It's almost intrusive. Like I assume that at the time, perhaps audiences had greater sensitivities for what that music was attempting to convey emotionally. I don't really know, but for me, it's just. I mean, it's not. I was going to say it's just noise. I mean, it's perfectly pleasant music. It doesn't say anything in the same way that the rest of the sort of mise en scène tries to communicate something generally.
I mean, he gets there, of course, doesn't he? With if you think about Psycho, where the score is, used as a sort of knife in its own way, and I think, I can imagine that was something he probably looked on his own films and thought, how can I actually change this up a little bit more? Because later Hitchcock movies do really interesting stuff with music, but he couldn't break every rule, I guess. So let's just kind of pile into this movie, I guess. It, as you say, it starts off as a romantic comedy, or it starts off with its beautiful little prologue. Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again. One thing I love about both the book and the movie is that the narration, which is only at the beginning and the end of the movie, it takes place in this future point, which is completely obscure. Like, we don't actually know where she is. And the character is never given a name in typical Hitchcock fashion. But the second Mrs. De Winter, played by Joan Fontaine, we don't know where she's ended up. We don't know where she's remembering Manderley from. But it is some point uncertain. And I always thought that was a really excellent kind of vibe to start things off with this kind of like, a sense of, and Hitchcock is kind of shooting this sort of extraordinarily beautiful, dreamy forest. It's funny, I've been playing Elden Ring and there's lots of dreamy forest in that. Dreamy forest, and kind of conjuring this kind of dreamlike, vibe for this place. But then after that, we go straight into the rom-com in Morocco. we should spare a moment for Mrs. Van Hopper.
Oh yes.
So the woman who's going to become, I don't know how to refer to her, the woman who's going to become the second Mrs. De Winter, the
protagonist, maybe?
protagonist. It's a little bit.
Yeah.
What was that movie? That Christopher Nolan movie called the character protagonist? Tenet. He was called protagonist, wasn't he? I was so stupid. Yes. So the protagonist, who's not moving in any direction in time, she is working as a companion for a crazy old rich lady who's called Mrs. Van Hopper, who is just fantastic. How would you describe Mrs. Van Hopper, Marsh?
A high society villain, I would say. Not a villain as in a sort of world-ending menace, but just like a casual conversational villain. She's up there with like Lady Catherine de Bourgh, as from Pride and Prejudice. Is just a terrific. But the performance is excellent as well. But the character as written is just this manifestation of outrageous pomposity and grasping sycophancy when it's required, but also just sort of like oblivious to her cruelty, to what might be going on. I love it. It's one of these performances that you just relish because the character is just so utterly repulsive.
She's
fantastic.
Great. Yeah, really good fun. And it's funny because she kind of gives the sort of first act of the movie this, something it never gets, which is a kind of comic relief. So the protagonist meets Maxim de Winter, the opening of the movie after the prologue, as he's standing on a cliff edge looking down into the water, and she sort of shouts at him to stop, and that's their kind of meet cute, which is him considering suicide, which is how this film begins. And then they have a kind of whirlwind romance together. Laurence Olivier is interesting in that he is not an actor I actually seen in that many movies. Like, I've seen him in this, I've seen him in Marathon Man, 40 odd years later, and I can't remember much else that I've actually seen him in, to my shame. Which is not that confusing, I guess, because he didn't actually do that many movies, I don't think. He was mostly a theatre actor, but he's great. I think he's really good in this movie. He's like genuinely scary. He's kind of handsome, but in a kind of non-Clark Gable way. He's got a weirdness about his features, I find.
There's a softness to him, I think, that Clark Gable doesn't have. He's not quite the sort of as though he is kind of an imperious aristocrat in this. And I think, that on paper that should make the things he's doing and the things he's saying should feel extremely dangerous.
Yeah.
But Laurence Olivier is a good piece of casting because he has that extra sort of softness, that sort of sympathy to him. It makes him much more kind of trustworthy instinctively, I think. That sort of softens some of the things that would otherwise be sort of like dangerous tells. And that kind of allows the sort of the tension to be preserved in a plausible way, because otherwise, you'd be, shouting at Joan Fontaine, get out of there, don't go with this strange man whose previous wife has died in mysterious circumstances. But that is the tension that's the heart of the movie, and I think the casting choice of Laurence Olivier is something that managed to sort of put a pin directly in the center of that.
Yes, exactly. And so he sort of, after they meet and he kind of takes a liking to her, they go off on a sort of whirlwind tour of his personal red flags, I would say, where he orders her out of the car if she's not having fun. He does a whole bunch of toxic stuff to her. I don't know if you read that story that came out. Was it a New Yorker story? It's called Cat Person, which was a sort of chillingly accurate portrayal of modern dating from a woman's perspective, with all the kind of, conjured very well, that kind of red flags arise and then you sort of move past them in the hope of finding love. It's kind of very pertinent here, I thought. It's just kind of, he's so horrible to her.
He treats her like a child, but not only does he treat her like a child, he openly values her childishness. And at one point, he even forbids her to reach the age of 35, I think it is, which, should set off alarm bells for somebody who's dating a recent widower. But I wonder what your opinion of this is. Like, I think a lot of that chauvinism isn't in the novel. Interestingly, a lot of that stuff is invented specifically for Hitchcock's version. And I wonder, watching this today, I mean, all of that stuff is deeply uncomfortable, as is like the protagonist's gushing acquiescence to it. But like, I find that discomfort to be very interesting and like essential to one of the film's qualities. But is it the film attempting to present this as sinister or negative, or is that just the values of the time that it was filmed?
I think there are, although there are plenty of movies from this era where casual misogyny is treated as, just basically great stuff.
Hmm.
I think in this movie it's very, very considered. It's funny, in that documentary they talk about how Hitchcock's original script for the movie began with the boat going to Monte Carlo, and Maxim was standing on the boat smoking a big cigar, and all the other passengers were getting really grossed out by the stink from his big cigar. And that's kind of where he was from in Hitchcock's mind. He was this kind of, nasty smell. um, and I think David O. Selznick, very much got him to tone that down. But I think Hitchcock is making him such a bastard, for a very good reason, in that he's less interested in him and he's fascinated in Joan Fontaine.
Hmm.
The way the camera finds her sort of porcelain skin, and this kind of wide open, expressive face. The way Hitchcock always shot, blonde ladies. And she is, as you say, she is so passive. She doesn't take the reins or take command or take control of almost anything
Hmm.
in this first half of this movie. She just allows things to happen to her. And
Yeah. But somehow she's extraordinarily winsome, I find. Like, I think she's believably naive, but she has like a depth to her puppyishness that's just maybe doesn't actually stops her being outright pathetic. Like, I think it would be easy to find her pathetic. I don't mean that in a sort of derogatory way. I mean that in a, uh, narrative way. But it's not really her fault. Like, that she is more or less a child, and she's in these circumstances. She's an orphan, and she's reliant on others for her money. Um, so I think it's okay to feel sympathy with her. I don't think she's being set up as a through and through idiot, which is one possible interpretation of why she would go with this man who is potentially dangerous. But that said,
no,
I don't think ultimately the Hitchcock, or at least the film, really respects her. I think the lens views her as a victim primarily, and she's like, we'll probably get into the differences in this adaptation from others, but or in fact from the text. But she's extra damseled in this adaptation, um, and she's not someone who, even in the last act, really makes her own choices uh, to romance an older man or to marry him, or how she then deals with his potential murderousness. Um,
no.
but Joan Fontaine carries it because she just has an immense sort of natural charm to her.
Yes, I mean it's funny, isn't it? Because I'm reaching deep down into my own, constructed masculinity, and wondering if the reason I don't find her terribly dislikable is because there's a horrible, Jungian part of me which like Hitchcock considers women who are incredibly compliant and incredibly, just sort of blank slates is something, somehow desirable. I mean, it's certainly something
Mm.
Hitchcock came back to again and again in his movies.
What's the line that what's the line with which Maxim proposes to her? It's something like, "I'm asking you to marry me, you little fool."
Yes, that's exactly what he says to
Like,
her. Yeah,
oh god, I mean that's not a, and she loves it. You're like,
yep. She's totally
no.
She's totally liberated by it. She gets to tell, Mrs. Van Hopper to go fuck herself, and well, I mean, it's quite the other way around, of course. Mrs. Van Hopper's a great scene where Maxim's just nipped out, and they've told him that they're gonna marry, and she just coolly breaks Joan Fontaine into pieces before she goes. I love the way she goes. You haven't been doing something you shouldn't, have you? Which I just really like.
Mm,
Like that often you find with these movies as well, and you find it with Brighton Rock too. Is like sex is, they're so terrified of sex in these movies that it's alluded to as this kind of like dark monster that's going to come out and eat someone. It's just
Right.
kind of,
Yeah.
it's such a frightening prospect. Um, so after a few sharp words, she stalks out of the movie, and Joan Fontaine, after this whirlwind romance, where becomes, they get married right there and then, don't they?
Mm.
And he's going to take her back to Mandalay. I mean, it's funny because his red flags have been, we find out that his wife Rebecca drowned, which means that he is taken to sort of staring into water and becoming very bleak and dark and saying, "We're going home." He's kind of very much that kind of vibe. Water's an interesting symbol in this movie. Actually, there's a lot of it, and later on, there's a great speech about how it was water that could claim Rebecca, and no one else could. But as we get into Act Two, when Joan Fontaine and Maxim head to Mandalay in a shower of rain, water again, I would say almost kind of orgasmic shower that's coming down here as they arrive at this mansion. And I think it's important to sort of talk about the way Mandalay itself is shot. I was really amazed by the way Hitchcock does this thing where he shoots her with the light that's gone through leaves that are outside the window and are projected onto her clothes and face. So she has this kind of shifting pattern on her at all points, which just makes her seem incredibly... It doesn't give it to any of the other characters. It's only ever on her. And just makes her feel almost like this kind of leaf in the wind inside this house. And the house itself, when I was watching it again yesterday, it's so meticulously put together and designed. It's so detailed. And
the model shots alone outside are incredible, actually.
Yeah, it's really impressive. And I think I'd only ever watched this on video before, probably. And seeing it now on the relatively nice version that's on YouTube, just seeing how much detail there is everywhere in every little spot, and this is a full-blown set, so it's all very, very placed. And
the way it's worth kind of dwelling on just the way the film looks altogether. I think this is one of the reasons that Hitchcock is widely admired. Wouldn't be surprising to say, but like every frame is absolutely stunning. And Hitchcock is not an improvisational director. Like he knows exactly what he's putting in the frame. And I think it's important to say that the frame at this time is very small by contrast with like modern cinematic expectations. And like it would be probably reductive to say that because it's small, one has to take more care about what one puts in it, but I think it does pose really interesting challenges when it's required to do scale. Like that's true of depicting Mandalay in its totality, but also like in the I think it's the first scene of the film in Monte Carlo, you get some incredibly brilliantly composed shots to frame both Maxim and the protagonist at a distance from each other on different outcrops of a high cliff face. And it's got to communicate not only their separation from each other, it's got to put them in the frame together and also give you a sense of the vertiginousness of those cliffs. And like I've done storyboarding in the past, and it's really hard to kind of put those compositions together. And that's like a lot of just the shots in this film made me pause and just realize just how ingenious it is, not only just to kind of fit all the required elements in the frame, but then to say something dramatic about them at the same time. And like it's in black and white, so that's one of the other tools that a cinematographer has out the window. And but even though it's in black and white, the section of the film that takes place in Monte Carlo just feels just so kind of breezy and warm and full of life. And then Mandalay is this kind of grand and austere place, and it's really noticeable that whenever there are shots of Mandalay's interiors, part of the frame is always descending into shadow. I think maybe that's not always true, but it feels like that. And it's like it's almost like it's impossible to see the totality of Mandalay. Something is always concealed from you, receding from you. And there's like I think one of my favorite shots in this entire film is almost as soon as they arrive at Mandalay. There's a rain shower. They go inside and surprise, all the staff have been arrayed to greet them in this kind of slightly terrifying, social moment. And and you get this wide shot of all the staff, minus Mrs. Danvers, interestingly, who becomes like a sort of nemesis for the protagonist in the film. You get this wide shot of all the staff standing in this absolutely insanely ornamental room before this giant arch. And I guess there must be like, it just looks like there's like the Arc de Triomphe has been dropped inside a room. And like I guess there must be like a mezzanine or something on top of the arch, but it's just ink dark up there. And like it's just terrifying and gives you this just sense of enormity and depth. But what the thing I really like about it is that Mrs. Danvers isn't in the frame, and then we get another closer shot of the staff, and Danvers just sweeps in from the left into center frame as though just apparating from smoke. And like genuinely, the entire room that you're watching it in gets 10 degrees colder. Like it's just an amazing combination of composition and understanding how to convey a character through the person of that actor and their poise and their presentation. It's just peerless, you know. That's why people like Hitchcock.
Yeah. No, and we should talk about Mrs. Danvers. She is the housekeeper, and as we meet her in this, I'm stopping because I'm trying to think of how to describe her. She is, she was the long-time housekeeper, and she was a confidant of the first Mrs. De Winter, we find out, and is kind of her sort of envoy in the world of the living, I guess.
Yeah.
She was considered at the time, lots of people talked about the sort of subtle, like lesbian, like when it was the earliest cinematic depictions of lesbianism. And they talk about in that documentary that the censor noted it and said, when they were reviewing that film, can we take a look at this? Is she too much of a lesbian? Hitchcock says he didn't intend that. And I'm not too sure, actually. I mean, there is that scene where she rubs her face against one of Rebecca's old furs, which I thought was like, some kind of imagery there.
Well, I mean, she literally picks up a piece of lingerie and paws at it and admires its transparency. So, like, I mean, I don't know that it needs to be, there's a lot of desire to sort of categorize things, and that creates just misunderstandings between people who have categorizations based on the mores of the 1930s and people who have categorizations based on a now slightly kind of more liberal understanding of the sexual spectrum. But like, I don't think it needs to be like a sexual love between them. It's what it is obviously an overbearing, obsessive love, which is definitely not maternal, and it's way beyond friendship. And you don't have to call that lesbianism if you don't want, but like,
quite probably, if not lesbian, it's certainly erotic, isn't it? I mean, and it's a film full of that. Rebecca has commanded this, this amount of fixations on her from just about everyone she's ever encountered, and with Mrs. Danvers, Danny, as a later character calls her, being kind of the most kind of infected by that, and her most kind of staunch ally. So we kind of get into this second act of the movie, which very much, I think, have you ever gone somewhere where you don't know the rules? Like, when you stay over someone's house when you're a kid, and you don't know, like, when if you're allowed to go to the toilet in the night, or like, what's going to happen, in the morning or something like that, or if you're at a hotel and blah, blah, blah. It very much captures the anxiety of being in a place where you don't know the way things work. And the movie spends quite a lot of time watching Joan Fontaine sort of wander about this huge space, getting lost, trying to work out how she's supposed to fit in here. It's very unnerving as well in this kind of time and place where everything is sort of done for you. And as an aristocratic, woman, or a woman who's married into aristocracy, basically all you can do is hold parties. Something that this character doesn't really want to do, at least at first. So it's kind of unusual of her kind of finding her way through this space, and she also gets to go into Rebecca's bedroom, where this is where we see Mrs. Danvers doing her kind of showing her underwear and showing her furs, and you've moved her hairbrush. And she puts a hairbrush exactly back in the spot where it was, which is great.
But
Um,
that scene is just it's a perfect realization of passive aggression, right? Like Mrs. Danvers is going through the room explaining it, but with every sort of item she picks up, she's aggrandizing Rebecca through these fine objects and suggesting that these things were fine because they were fitting for somebody as perfect as Rebecca, and obviously by the same token, the protagonist is essentially being dragged and diminished. But like Danvers, or rather Judith Anderson, who plays Mrs. Danvers, her expression is sort of like part entranced by Rebecca. And so it's almost believable that she might not recognize the distress she's causing the protagonist. But in the end, it's plausibly disguised mercilessness. It's a really chilling scene of manipulation.
yes, and very very it's spooky. Like
Mm,
it's like a kind of, it feels like a ghost story where there's no ghost, but there is. It's kind of,
mm.
she's a very, I love how present the movie makes Rebecca in various ways. And Mrs. Danvers is just one of the ways in which Rebecca kind of continues to sort of haunt the movie. The guy who's the nice guy, who's like the accountant who looks after Maxime's affairs, and she can kind of be sort of open and honest with him because he's approachable. And she asks him what Rebecca was like, and he kind of has this slight disarmed moment and tells her she was the most beautiful creature he'd ever seen. Um, and and that's when we cut to, I think this is the scene where Joe Fontaine's lying in bed, sort of tossing and turning and having a dream, and there's a voiceover going, she was the most beautiful creature I'd ever seen. She was the most beautiful creature I've ever seen. Lisa needs places. Dental planners. It's just, I just couldn't. I really wanted to hear that in that section because it's exactly that scene from The Simpsons. Anyway, yeah. So I'm trying to think what else there is to cover in this kind of first part of the movie. Maxim
Well,
himself is he's sort of jumping in and out, coming and going, and he retains a lot of charm, which is why you kind of, I don't know, in the same way that she pines for him to return when he comes back, you sort of enjoy it when he does, because he sort of cuts through the bluster and he says, "Oh, don't listen to Mrs. Danvers. She's ridiculous, and you don't need to do that."
but isn't that worse? That's almost like that's. I mean, that is gaslighting, isn't it? He doesn't. He just completely dismisses the idea that there would be anything more sinister about Mrs. Danvers than there is. He's just like, oh, you don't need to listen to her. But what John Fontaine's character is trying to say is is that there is something kind of unnerving and manipulative occurring, and I think his presence, as reassuring as it is, also serves to compound her own sense of self-doubt in a way which is, psychologically incredibly distressing.
There's a great scene where we meet Jack Favell, who is coming in through the window.
Oh yeah.
This is, as he describes himself, I'm Rebecca's favorite cousin, played by George Sanders, who was the voice of Shere Khan the tiger in Jungle Book, and in possession of one of the greatest voices in cinema history. Yeah. Often played cads like this. And yes, he's only really in 2 or 3 scenes in the movie, one here and then a couple much later on, but he's fantastic fun, I think. An excellent kind of evil bastard. There's a great bit later on where he's just like, I'm an ordinary bloke.
Well, okay. Well, I think we'll unpack this later, but is he an evil bastard?
Well, no.
I mean, he's made out to be as evil as he could be, but his actual motivations are more honest than the protagonists ultimately. But yeah, we'll get there. Sorry.
We'll get there. But for this point in the movie, he's just immense fun, I find. I don't quite know why I have such a connection to George Sanders, but whenever he's in any movie ever, I'm just kind of, I just want to talk to you, weirdo. So yeah, we meet him, and we see the protagonist's sort of attempts to fit in here and her failure too. She breaks a statue.
Oh God!
Oh God!
It's mortifying, isn't it? It's like breaking it is one thing, but the fact she tries to hide it like a naughty child and is exposed in her folly top to bottom. Wow, that's so cringe, as Hitchcock himself would have no doubt noted. Uh,
It's very cringe and totes a mosh. We meet, Maxim's is it his sister and her husband, who is kind of, I don't know. It's hard to describe her. Actually, she's kind of urbane and witty, but also kind of like a lot of the people in this movie. Kind of, I don't know, like her brother. She's got a sort of streak of nihilism in her as well. It's that kind of weird mixture of keeping up appearances and also not caring about anything at all. Which actually, thinking about some of the posher people I've known, is kind of a feature, isn't it? It's that kind of weird mixture of self-aggrandizing and self-deprecation that seems to be a kind of signature weapon of the upper classes, and it's quite horrible to everyone else. If you've ever seen a room full of normal people and then a posh person comes in and starts talking about Oxford and cricket, it's kind of it's a very fish out of water vibe here, I guess, is what I'm driving at. And she just can't compete at that level. She's got no bants at all. And everyone
Joan
else
Fontaine, you mean?
Joan Fontaine has no bants at all, no. And so it's kind of, she seems very, very well, as we described, she's so passive and so terrified of everyone and so eager to please. And then eventually she gets to this point where she's going to sort of take things in hand, and she's convinced that Maxim is still in love with Rebecca, which she would explain his irrational outbursts of anger, which continue pretty much randomly. There's a boathouse that she goes in, which he's utterly horrible to her again about because he's freaked out by that.
Yeah, she even explicitly says, "How am I meant to guess?" And he doesn't have an answer for that. He just storms off.
Yeah. Yeah. And he also does a thing, which is excellent toxic masculinity as well, where he will chastise her and then he'll chastise himself and say she hasn't done anything wrong, it's all him, which again is I mean, perhaps I'm being too revealing about myself, but is when you're feeling terribly depressed in life and out of control and stuff like that, inflicting the absolute worst of yourself on the people you're closest to. I mean, it's not acceptable. It's not a good reason to do it, but it's kind of, I don't know, there's a truth to it, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And all the more tragic for her just trying to, fit into the right peg into the hole for him and just failing at every point. And then, of course, she does this, they're going to do this costume party, which she has the idea for. And this is just mortifying. She's going to copy a dress that's in one of Maxim's ancestors is seen wearing in a portrait. This is suggested to her by Mrs. Danvers. I was quite amused by her drawings of her other costume ideas, which include, I think, like a Knight Templar and various other D&D characters, maybe. I don't think there's a wizard in there, but she draws a few things. And then, they have the ball, and she appears at the top of the stairs in this ridiculous puffy dress, and Maxim is absolutely furious about this because it was Rebecca had worn an identical dress at the last ball before her death. This is just a
setup.
It's a setup. It's such it's a stupid setup because she's found out immediately about it.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, there's no comeuppance for Danvers, which is weird. I mean, the film does a clever thing of sort of eliding time and thus also consequences. Things that would naturally fall out as a result of this upsetting moment, like saying, "Oh, Danvers literally suggested it to me," never occur, and you don't get that kind of cathartic moment of understanding and forgiveness. It just, the kind of paranoia rolls on. But what's so good about this is it's sort of set up at a moment of sort of truce between Danvers and the protagonist, I don't think, I'm not sure if Danvers just totally apologizes, but there's some sort of kind of agreement between them after some kind of initial hostility that they're going to try and work together for the better of the house and for the happiness of Maxim. And so when Danvers sort of suggests this dress, there's you're so kind of eager to escape the film's growing anxiety, like the heroine, that you're willing to believe that this might actually be true, and that even though you obviously Danvers is suspicious because literally everything about the film makes her seem suspicious and threatening. You do think that maybe this could be like a film about the redemption of Danvers as much as it is anything about anything else, like sort of. Is it Marilla Cuthbert in Anne of Green Gables, who is sort of initially kind of an austere foster mother to the protagonist and absolutely terrifying and strict, but then ultimately is redeemed by Anne of Green Gables' goodness. And so, I think the first time I watched this was probably around the same time as I watched an adaptation of Anne of Green Gables. So I was really kind of wrong-footed by the fact that Danvers absolutely fucking shanks her, but not only just that betrayal, but then the scene afterwards in which the protagonist is in a state of absolute despair, to just openly and directly encourage her to throw herself to her death out of a window. The way that is presented is so purely and unabashedly evil. It's genuinely shocking, I think.
No, I couldn't believe it when I first saw this scene, and you're right, because another movie would have had the fallout from this moment to have been some kind of conversation of oh, Mrs. Danvers told me to wear this dress, and and sort of finding out and all that sort of stuff. But actually, you're right, it leads somewhere much more interesting, in that it goes into this scene which is this scene of intimacy between them, horrible intimacy, the sharing of intimate details. And yeah, just this thing she says to her. I've got the quote here: "You thought that you could be Mrs. De Winter, live in her house, walk in her steps, take the things that were hers, but she's too strong for you. You can't fight her. No one ever got the better of her. Never, never. She was beaten in the end, but it wasn't a man, it wasn't a woman, it was the sea." Which is great. And then Joan is kind of, oh, stop it, stop saying these horrible things to me, and she goes to the balcony, and that's where she says, "Go ahead, jump." Which is pretty direct. He never loved you, so why go on living? Jump and it will all be over.
Yeah.
It's genuinely disturbing, I think.
But it's also just like her character up until this point has been ambiguous in order to activate the gaslighting aspect of the story,
Yeah.
And now there's no pretense at all, and the abruptness at which she decides the gloves are off at this point in a way which I didn't expect. I expected it to carry on with this sort of ambiguity, but then there's a foghorn, and the film just shifts gears altogether.
It really does. It really does. It's funny because in another movie, I've got to stop making up speculative movies, which is slightly different from the one we're discussing. But you might imagine. I mean, I guess it's a gothic romance trope, isn't it? The icy, mad woman in the attic who turns out to have a heart of gold. She doesn't in this movie, and this isn't the climactic reveal of the villain. This is about halfway through the movie, and her journey past this point, Mrs. Danvers' journey past this point, is actually more nuanced than you'd imagine, because you're right, she's laying it all on the line basically here. She is, without any real desire to kind of preserve herself here, because there is an assumed moment after this. I mean, luckily a foghorn rings through the night and sends her somewhere else, but she is entirely candid about her feelings.
Yes, in this other fictional movie, this would be the climactic scene. And
yes.
Then Maxim would burst into the room and shoot Mrs. Danvers or something like that. But,
that's right,
yeah. The fact that this occurs halfway through, you're like, oh my God, what else can happen,
Yes, and actually the film more or less leaves her behind for quite a while now. Because we go into the kind of the close of this act, which is the kind of reveal scene. A foghorn blasts through the night, a ship has run aground due to the fog, and in the rescue of its crew, a sunken boat has been discovered with Rebecca's body in it. And we have this this scene in the boathouse, which is, I mean, I think in a film full of brilliant Hitchcocky scenes, this is my favourite. It's a little play that takes place in this little space, which was Rebecca's own space. This was her sort of hangout. um, where and the camera moves. Someone talked in this documentary about how the camera moves as they're talking about her as Rebecca herself. The camera becomes her and moves across her objects. And as Maxim's telling the story about what happened on a night, the night she died, the camera follows her steps. And that's how they kind of, because there was lots of discussions when they were making the movie. Well, how can we cast, if we're going to do a flashback, how could we cast Rebecca when she's, the version in our imaginations is so much better than anyone could, ever play. And that's the solution that Hitchcock has, that in this moment when she's being conjured by this kind of final, truthful conversation about her, where it all comes out, he allows the camera to take on her vision, basically. And it's this brilliant scene where it all comes out about how Maxim and Rebecca actually felt about each other. And this is the twist, which is I didn't see coming. I mean, I'm terrible at twists. I never see them coming ever. I'm just an idiot for them. But this one, apart from Arrival, I got that one because I learned what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was at university. Oh. And there's a certain point in that movie where they talk about the way that the alien sentences work, and I just went, oh, okay. The whole film unfolded. But that's the only time it's happened. In this movie, she's talking to him about, the pain that Maxim feels, that his first wife had been a sham marriage. Rebecca declared that she had no intention of keeping to her vows, but would pretend to be the perfect wife and hostess for the sake of appearances. And Joan Fontaine says, you must have loved her terribly. And Olivia says, you thought I loved Rebecca. You thought that. I hated her, he says. And, I mean, yes, maybe I'm an idiot for not seeing that coming, but I still think that moment is so badass.
Yeah, it's definitely out of the blue. Although, I mean, it's slightly weird that Maxim would seem to think that the protagonist would think anything other, because there's literally nothing that could have clued her into imagining that Maxim hated her.
Yes, it's a very particular narcissism there, isn't it? It's kind of, you didn't know what I thought, but never told you or made any kind of, what an idiot you are for not realizing my secrets, my terrible dark secrets. Yes, and we find out what really happened, which was when she claimed that she was pregnant by her cousin and lover. He's her first cousin. It's terrible. She taunted Maxim that the estate might pass to someone other than Maxim's line. During a heated argument, she fell, struck her head, and died. Now, this is an interesting bit, because in the book, he kills her, right?
Yeah.
In the book, I think he strikes her, and she falls down. Does he shoot her blind?
Yeah, he fucking shoots her. He straight up shoots her in a rage as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, well, I don't know whether we want to get into the differences between adaptations, but I maybe we should circle back to this after we've got through the final act, because I think there's quite a lot to say about the different adaptations that sort of tie in all kinds of things, which are maybe better elucidated once we have the whole thing in front of us. But yes. It's worth. I mean, maybe it's worth saying that one of the reasons that in this version that Rebecca is hit by Maxim supposedly, but then only trips and falls and bashes her own head open on a piece of fishing tackle. This is due to compliance with the Hollywood production code, which mandated that any cinematic spousal murder must be seen to receive punishment. And for reasons that will become clear, that meant that it was impossible for Maxim to then kill Rebecca outright in this story. And maybe just to say something else about the Hollywood production code, because it's kind of a weird piece of history. But there was like a moral panic in Hollywood, not only about the content of the films, but also about the sort of Hollywood lifestyle itself. And so the state of cinema was essentially being threatened by state codes of censorship, which would mean just recutting the movie for each state. So Hollywood then decided to sort of see this off. They would then adopt a code themselves, which they would self-police. And it prohibited depictions of just all sorts of things. including mixed race couples, incidentally, if you want to know where this sort of moralizing gets you. And there's this brilliant photograph called "Thou Shalt Not," which is sort of like a poster decrying this code of censorship, and it's staged to simultaneously list and break 10 principles of the code. And it's got this drunk, drug addicted woman in lingerie pointing a gun at a dead policeman. But yes, anyway, that's actually a further weird aside. I think in the 1930s, it was the guy who was in charge of policing Hollywood who had his own kind of ability to interfere and directly censor and change films. He was called Joseph Breen. And I do wonder if, like, Dr. Breen in Half-Life 2 has some resonance for that, because he's also a sort of collaborator with oppression who's brought in to self-police humanity's willful nature.
Yes.
Maybe not. Maybe that's completely unrelated, but I like to think it's an echo.
No, absolutely.
But anyway, that's the reason that Maxim doesn't kill Rebecca in this version.
It's funny, isn't it? Because even if you haven't read the book, you can tell by the way the scene plays that it is something they've changed from the book, because it's so obvious what should have happened there. But the fact he says, "I hit her, yes, I did do that, and she did fall over, but then she got up again. But then she tripped and died."
Yeah. Well, you don't need to believe him. That's the thing. I mean,
no.
The film sort of... I don't think the film is particularly equivocatory about this. I think the film sides with Maxim and the protagonist, and through their eyes, it absolves them. But certainly the original book is much more ambiguous, and I think that has interesting repercussions to how the whole thing lands. But we'll probably come back to that later because I want to bang on about the differences between the adaptation at some point.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, that kind of the end of Act 2. I would say I love dividing films up into arbitrary acts. I would say that was the end of Act 2, where he kind of says to her, "You're gonna leave me. You don't love me anymore." And she says, "No, I now I know the truth, and that you didn't technically kill, but were involved in covering up the death of Rebecca. I do, in fact, still love you very, very much, more than ever, if anything." She doesn't say that, but she basically says that. This is a weird one. Like, she has been so passive, so much of a sort of I was going to say candle in the wind, but that's weird. But she is, and it is the fact that the truth is kind of given to her that kind of gets her into a kind of bit more of an active role. Although, as you said earlier, not that much, but just a bit more. As we come in on the third act, she's wearing a black dress with some shoulder pads, symbolizing her agency, because shoulder pads mean agency. She's going to do some crime covering up. So what's happened is the body's been found, and Maxim is basically, suspected of murder because of the kind of discrepancy in how everything's sort of shaken out here. As you said earlier, this bit of the film's quite weird because it turns into a sort of legal thriller for a little while. While we try and work out what's happening. I'm not sure this movie does I think this last act is probably the weakest, because it mostly is just Maxim getting away with murder, or not murder, through luck.
Yeah.
And being a posh man. It's funny watching him, like, talk to the chief of police, and chief of police saying, "We'll both play some golf once it's all blown over," and just thinking, wow, that's some white privilege right there.
Yeah. But I don't think, weirdly, the film doesn't seem to be criticizing that. It seems to be saying that's fine.
Yeah.
Which is disturbing.
It turns out she had cancer. She wasn't pregnant, so she was going to die anyway. I know I'm sort of racing through this, but the movie, it kind of wraps up pretty quick here. And this is when George Sanders' character comes back into play, and tells them, he gets into the car with them, which is one of my favourite scenes in the movie. He gets into the car with them and starts eating their lunch. This is where he tells them that he's a perfectly ordinary, harmless bloke. and tells him that he maligns the feeling of driving a motor car that is not your own, which I really like, considering he was the guy who was screwing Rebecca.
Oh yeah, gosh, I never thought of that.
Yeah. And he basically admits that he just wants to have the experience of living very well without doing anything, which I think is honest, if nothing else. And he's going to blackmail Maxim in order to get that.
Well, this is the interesting thing. I see, because the film presents Fauvel as being a disgusting and grasping asshole, it gets away with the fact that he is earnestly interested in solving the mystery of who killed Rebecca, and he thinks, with good reason, that Maxim is the murderer. And his attempts to expose Maxim are just. That's entirely just that he does it. And it's weird that he's the bad guy.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a tricky one. It's. I mean, no one in this movie is anything like as bad as Rebecca, which is why they all kind of get away with it, really, because she was so awful and she was this kind of being of pure evil, basically. No one else is really ever going to be subject. There's this moment because they bring in Mrs. Danvers to kind of talk to the police and kind of she gives them the name of the doctor that she'd gone to see to sort of about her pregnancy, and he's the guy who gives the final piece of the puzzle where she was terminally ill, basically. So that's why Rebecca went and taunted Maxim, was because she wanted to sort of stick it to him because she knew she was going to die anyway. But this scene where Mrs. Danvers sort of comes in and is kind of forced to testify in front of all these people, and there's this bit where she says she used to just laugh at you all. She used to find you so ridiculous, and she just used to sit there and laugh. And I find that so creepy. There's something very creepy about that. Like someone who is so utterly deranged in terms of their, psychopathy, that they just find everyone kind of hilarious. I mean, again, it's a weird view of womanhood being in this movie. Women are, well, I mean, let's list them off. There are, bossy aristocrats, shrinking violets with no agency, obsessed housekeepers. It's sort of, it's very hard to be a woman in Hitchcock's world, I think. And I think the movie really punishes Rebecca and punishes her above anyone else, really. And uses her death as an excuse to basically let Maxim get away with murder.
So let's do the differences between adaptations thing now.
Yes, because I haven't seen the Ben Wheatley one.
Well, that's interesting again. But I think it's I think the whole thing is much more ambiguous in the original book. Like Hitchcock's film fairly unabashedly sides with Maxim and the protagonist, but you're really not under any obligation in the book to believe Maxim. Obviously, the protagonist does at that time, but we never. The book ends without the denouement that occurs in the film, without really any closure on whether Maxim is going to go to jail. It doesn't close any of these things. It doesn't tell you what happens later. And as you say, the narration occurs in this sort of nameless time period. You don't know whether... I mean, Maxim could turn out to be a complete bastard after the close of this novel. And that's still a possibility that's floating there. And, that he's lied all along and actually Rebecca was a fine person.
Yeah.
That's still sort of floating there. And I think, and it's not just an ambiguity for whether Maxim is a bad person or not, but the fact that Maxim in the book straight up shoots Rebecca in a rage and the protagonist instantly makes her peace with it changes the protagonist's level of agency, I think, in quite a key way. It changes her morality in quite a key way. And I think this feels like it's much more in conversation with the myths and stories that precede Rebecca, like the myth of Bluebeard, sort of the multiple wife murdering aristocrat, and Jane Eyre as well, which is, similarly, it has a inscrutable and dangerous man in it, Mr. Rochester.
Yeah, Wuthering Heights as well.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Actually, the recent Jane Eyre adaptation with Mia Wasikowska and Michael Fassbender is terrific, and I think Fassbender is absolutely terrifying in it. But part of the point of Rebecca the novel is that Maxim could quite easily turn out to be a misogynistic murderer. the question of whether he is Bluebeard or not is sort of like the central tension of it. Schrodinger's Bluebeard, you might call it. And I think Hitchcock does play with that a little, but he kind of largely depletes Maxim of his sinister qualities. Like, he gets shouty every now and again, and there's a sort of flicker of danger, but no more. And the fact that he doesn't kill Rebecca, even though that choice was probably out of Hitchcock's hands, at least, doesn't kill Rebecca by his own account, sort of compounds a like canonical reading in which he is also a victim of Rebecca. And the new adaptation by Ben Wheatley sort of splits the difference. Like, he does shoot and kill Rebecca, but only after Rebecca has put the gun to her chest and goaded him into doing it, saying that only by killing her will he ever be free. And divorce is a thing. That's another way. But even in the context of that film, the film wants to exonerate him as well. And sort of weirdly, ironically, at the time, because Armie Hammer plays Maxim in this film, I thought like Armie Hammer was just sort of too puppyishly nice. And he sort of like barks, but he never looks like he'll bite. Sadly, things have been since alleged about Armie Hammer, which might then, those cast his performance in a different light. Maxim's admitted murderousness sort of impacts the protagonist's level of complicity or her credulity. Like Du Maurier's protagonist exonerates him instantaneously for the worst possible version of the crime. And that version of the protagonist is simply pleased that he loves her more than he loved Rebecca. And so, that sort of indicts the protagonist in a way, in a kind of dark way, which I don't think either of the two films really do.
No, the book's much more troubling, isn't it? It's it's a book that's genuinely looking at what the Gothic romance means, what the Jane Eyres of this world means, where there's this kind of this previous wife, this kind of previous sin which is hanging over you all, and what that actually, how that would play, what that means for one's sense of self in this situation.
And when the protagonist just wholly accepts Maxim's account of things and decides then to cover things up, like, you don't know whether that's naivety or calculation. Like, is she just refusing to be another victim of Rebecca's ghost, or is she walking right into another form of victimhood at the hands of a killer husband? You don't know at the end of that book. No. And I think I like it because Hitchcock presents a scenario where there is less for her to forgive Maxim for. It's then sort of like shrouded in less ambiguity. And as a result of that, it can never provide the heroine the same self-assertion or like self-dooming arc that occurs in the book. Like, the nameless protagonist of the film begins as this like soppy, naive girl and ends fairly soppy and naive too, I think, even though Maxim is sort of protesting otherwise. Oh, you've aged 1 billion years, damn you, sort of. But I think it's also a conscious choice that Hitchcock removes her agency, because in the book she accompanies Maxim to the doctor to make that key discovery about Rebecca's illness, and then they drive back to Manderley and see it burning together, and that's where it ends, on the road to Manderley. And the ashes blew towards us with the salt wind from the sea. And it's not even explicit that Manderley is burning. Like, we assume it is. But we don't ever get to see Danvers being toasted. We don't know, what the legal fate of Maxim is, or whether he turns out to be a shit. The only thing we know is that the heroine survives to give this account, distantly recollected some years later. And I just love how off-key and ambiguous that is. Whereas Hitchcock just leaves her at home while the men do the actual work of detection. And by doing so, he places her at Danvers' mercy. And he does something brilliant with that, because then he's trying to conjure this heart in mouth moment of tension as Maxim and Crawley are driving back to Manderley and they see the building aflame. And you expect as the viewer that the protagonist is going to be in the burning building. And that's where the sort of the excitement and thrill of that denouement occur. But she's safely outside, and Danvers gets a dramatic exit instead.
They make a point to show that she brings the dog with her as well.
Yes,
because there's definitely going to be someone who's going, but what about that dog we saw? Did the dog get it out?
Jasper. But I think Hitchcock sort of buys that dramatic thrill at the expense of the the evolution of the film's heroine. And I honestly I suspect that is Hitchcock's own chauvinism showing through. And it just seemed more believable and sympathetic to him to have a protagonist who is gooeyly in love with Maxim and just believes him implicitly. And so that, the protagonist can't be accused of deceit then because she just believes it. Rather than have a more complex heroine who develops this dark agency and consciously chooses to absolve murder in pursuit of her own happiness.
Yes, which we'll come to, won't we, with Brighton Rock?
Sorry, one last thing. I know I've just been talking stupidly for ages, but like the new adaptation goes the exact other way. Like the way that Maxim actually gets locked up in this. And so there's nobody to go and visit the doctor. And so the heroine goes and visits the doctor by herself and actually breaks into his offices to obtain the necessary evidence.
Does she do like Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible and sort of hangs down on a wire?
Well, no, she does it. It's quite plausible. She says she's left her handbag in there and the night porter lets her in.
Why didn't Tom Cruise do that in Mission Impossible?
Yeah. But then it has this weird. There's like another. The line about how only the sea could claim somebody like Rebecca. That's changed in this to be a sort of slightly kind of out of place feminist statement where Danvers asserts what a kind of willful and self-possessed woman Rebecca was. So obviously a man had to kill her, which is an interesting take on it. But like also. I don't know how I feel about the association of independence with evil.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to make sense to me. And then the at the end of the new adaptation, you get an extra scene in which the happy couple are buying a place in Cairo for some reason, and then it ends with this last line: "I woke up this morning and left the dead behind. I can see the woman I am now, and I know that I have made the right decision." To save the one thing worth walking through flames for, love. Which is not a great. I wouldn't have added that line. I don't think.
No, I mean the movie at least has a bit of nihilism to it. I mean they do snog with this big like fucking inferno going on behind them. I mean that's pretty cool. I like that. Miss Danvers dies horribly. House falling in around her. There's something of that there. But I do think it is a very big ask. I mean, I haven't seen the Ben Wheatley one, but the idea of, I don't know, Rebecca is a postmodern comment on an antiquated storytelling technique about a woman being whisked off her feet and taken to a place full of secrets. And I think there probably is an adaptation to be had there that could do that in 2020 something. But, it sounds to me like they kind of, as you say, they sort of, in some bits, they kind of put the head down and went for it a bit more. And then in others, they just couldn't help but do the sort of, BBC One Sunday night kind of take on the material.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be too mean on Ben Wheatley's version. There are things that I like about it. Kristen Scott Thomas as Mrs. Danvers is absolutely amazing in the role, as she is in literally every performance she's ever given, I think. But she has quite a different take on Mrs. Danvers, which is sort of whisperingly evil in a way, which is also kind of superficially, plausibly not charming exactly, but charismatic.
Yeah.
In a way which makes the protagonist's deception by her much more kind of believable. But yeah, I don't think Wheatley's version otherwise improves on Hitchcock's, despite its well-intentioned attempts to make the protagonist kind of more powerful, especially in the last part of the movie. I don't think it ends up saying anything complicated about her absolution of Maxim, which I think the book does. It leaves that much more kind of like a hanging bum note.
No, and I saw a quote from Wheatley actually, where he was, just as I was reading around on Wikipedia today, where he was saying that he felt like the story had been fundamentally robbed of something by changing the murder to an accident. He wanted to give the story that back. And Ben Wheatley is a clever guy. I'm sure he doesn't see himself as sort of shadow boxing with Hitchcock. I think he just wanted to do a different take on it. And I think it is true that something is robbed when you take that out of the story, but it's a movie made in 1940. You're just not going to get there.
Yeah.
And as it is, even though it's not that story, I still think it kind of, I don't know, it's got a big fire. I think the big fire is probably there standing in for
Mrs. Danvers' exit is a fantastic invention on the part of Hitchcock, I think.
Yes.
Partly because of just the expression on her face as the ceiling caves in on her is like one of religious ascension. Like it's she looks delighted in a kind of moment of grace kind of way, which is deeply, deeply troubling.
Yeah, pure like rapture. It's really creepy.
Well, she's being reclaimed by hell from whence she came, I guess, is the inference.
Yeah, and then the movie closes on Rebecca's bed burning. And then midnight oil kick in, and then the song plays over the credits.
There's one anecdote about the kind of war between Selznick and Hitchcock about that final shot, which is quite interesting. That apparently Selznick was really keen that the smoke from the burning Mandalay formed the letter R in the sky, and Hitchcock took advantage of his distraction with Gone with the Wind in order to change it to being this embroidered pillow burning, which because he thought it was a little too on the nose, quite rightly, to have the smoke form the letter R.
See, I don't know. Maybe I'm just flamboyant, but in the documentary, you can hear, Peter Bogdanovich interviewing Alfred Hitchcock, and Bogdanovich is saying, like, I heard about the thing with the, the R in the sky, and Hitchcock, with just polite contempt, just going, yes, the R in the sky, that's what he wanted, and all this sort of stuff. And I was thinking, that's not so. I think that's quite cool. I think that's quite metal.
Yeah.
I wouldn't hate that. I mean, I think Hitchcock's probably is the better one, but ideas always seem, terrible in retrospect, I think. I mean, yeah. So that's the end of Rebecca. What a movie. Flies by, doesn't it? It's over 2 hours long, but it actually goes quite quickly.
Oh gosh,
considering that almost all of it takes place in like one location, and it really, really rips along.
Barely hangs together at places. Like I think that the first part in Monte Carlo, like it's noticeable that all the actors are delivering their lines incredibly fast, as though the film just wants to get out of there.
Yeah.
But like it's just a delicious film. It's melodramatic. It's kind of lusty. It's lurid. It's extreme. And yes, it doesn't feel like a fusty old mill movie from the before times, as you might fear.
No,
it's a rollicking ride.
Yeah, and you just got that kind of poetry with. I mean, I hated myself when I just saying that I hate myself for kind of being almost like one of those dusty golden age Hollywood types. But there is a kind of poetry to how Hitchcock moves his camera. There's a directedness and a directiveness in how he pauses, how he moves, how he makes the camera. He positions the camera in a close shot of two people, and then he'll follow the scene on from there. All stuff that no one ever bothers doing now because it looks weird and doesn't kind of chime with modern tastes.
I tell you what, though, I mean, out of all the things that make old movies feel weird, like the fact that the aspect ratio forces characters to stand so close to each other when they're having a conversation is probably the number one. But I mean, that's true up until like the 1990s, I think. So
yeah.
It's noticeable. You're like, oh god, I bet you could smell his breath standing there. I wouldn't ever, especially in post-pandemic times. So it makes you feel very awkward.
Absolutely. Should we talk about Brighton Rock a bit?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, this is such a good companion piece, isn't it? Like another film in which a central plot thread of it is that a naive young girl falls in love with and marries somebody who might potentially plan to kill her.
Yeah.
But like the contrast, I mean, this is very superficial, but the contrast is that, whilst Hitchcock exonerates Maxim, or at least like the protagonist makes peace with Maxim's nature, you keep thinking that Pinky might be redeemed, but he never is.
No.
It's a dark film without redemption. It has incredible disquieting ambiguity. There's no easy answers here to human nature. It's squalid, It's kind of almost a wretched little story, which exists at the exact opposite end of the social spectrum to Rebecca, but shares so much with it. It's really interesting that you pick these to go together. I mean,
Well,
they're both beach films, aren't they? So
they're both
that's
beach
nice.
films. Yeah, it's it's funny, isn't it, that in Rebecca, Maxim is given a second chance and he takes it. Yeah, he takes that second chance, and him and in the movie version of things, him and Joan Fontaine are gonna live and they're gonna be in love and stuff like that. In this movie, uh, uh, Pinky also gets a second chance. He also kind of gets away with murder in the same way as Maxim, but decides to just keep doing the horrible things that he's going to do to the point of his own destruction. I was fascinated by him as a character who just never changes. He's exactly the awful person he is when we first meet him. And, he is the main character of the movie and he has no redemption. In fact, the movie's about that.
Yeah.
And it's just great. It's another character who says that she's like Brighton Rock, which is the same. It says Brighton, wherever you bite it, all the way through. But actually, I think it applies much more to him as a character, as someone who is just top to bottom this guy.
We should probably give a quick synopsis of what it's about.
Yeah, so Brighton Rock, based on the novel by Graham Greene, adapted by Graham Greene and Terence Rattigan. I didn't know that Terence Rattigan also did it. And it is the story of a kind of crime that goes down in Brighton, 1935. A gangster's been killed, and the reporter who reported on the story is kind of hunted down by the gang members who are exposed by his story, and the film is basically about them trying to cover up for his murder and kind of trying to cover their tracks. And the inheritor of this gang is one Pinky, who is played by Richard Attenborough. I was going to say David Attenborough. It's not David Attenborough. It's his brother, Richard Attenborough. And that kind of we kind of follow Pinky, and he kind of, his relationship with this girl who is a potential witness to this crime, and kind of how he sort of brings her under his spell, and how they're kind of hunted down by a plucky, characterful lady called Ida Arnold. And it takes place in sort of interwar Brighton, which the opening crawl describes as, it's kind of a cradle of crime and filth, which is funny to think about Brighton, which is sort of, people call it Islington by the Sea now, don't they? But it's a really it's directed by the Bolting brothers, who are kind of guys who sort of directed a whole bunch of stuff kind of across the span of kind of post-war cinema for quite a long period. Richard Attenborough's kind of star-making turn in this film. He is fantastic. He's another actor, just like Laurence Olivier, who I don't really know from movies that well. Like, I know him from this, I know him from The Great Escape, Jurassic Park, A Miracle on 34th Street, I would say, are the main movies I know in the Richard Attenborough oeuvre. He's good in all of those, but I mostly know him as a pretty good director of some great movies like A Bridge Too Far and Shadowlands and things like that. I don't know what your prior experience of the old Dick Master General was.
Purely in his bearded older form.
The final form.
Seeing him as a young man is very strange. Maybe that also lends the film a sort of another kind of aspect to its sort of unease. It's seeing somebody transformed that you're otherwise quite familiar with as something different.
Yeah, he's great. And there's a whole cast of really kind of ordinary looking British kind of character actors in this movie, which I think
it's got
is really
Doctor
great.
Who in it, hasn't it? It's got
Doctor
William
Who's
Hartnell.
in it, yeah. William Hartnell, and then
playing quite a different role. Again, he's a character actor I only know as Doctor Who when he was quite an older and slightly emaciated looking gentleman. In this, he plays like a hard nut, hoodlum basically. He's quite menacing and charismatic in it, in a way which you wouldn't necessarily expect from his later roles as Doctor Who, although that Doctor Who also carries an element of menace to him. But
isn't he the Doctor Who at one moment tries to kill someone with a rock Did I hallucinate that in a fever dream, or is that something that actually happens in a Doctor Who episode?
I'm not really a Doctor Who aficionado, but I do believe that the William Hartnell's Doctor Who does try to kill somebody at some point, or is at least certainly a much more kind of potentially Mephistophelian figure than the cuddlier Doctor Who's of late.
I think there is. I think what it is there's a guy who's like dying or moaning or something and making too much noise, and he's about to kill him with a rock, and someone says, "Doctor, just don't kill that guy with a rock," which I'm sure people will be able to correct me on. Anyway, Brighton Rock. I mean, again, this was something I saw as a teenager. Had a terrible Gruy transfer on it, a video or DVD, I think I had. And again, it's much nicer. You can watch it on YouTube. It's another kind of weird. Again, like often these movies, they've got weird genre sort of vibes. This is a gangster movie, but it also kind of pushes against the kind of conventions of the genre as well. It's very nihilistic. I remember, the book, which I haven't read since I was a teenager, but the book kind of wrong-footed me because it starts off as a gangster story, and then, as so many novels do by Graham Greene, it meanders into an exploration of Catholic guilt and original sin, which he was very prone to doing all through his career. But at the time when I first read it, I'd never read anything like that. It starts off with this, with as a big crime sort of investigation, and then becomes this really quite weird exploration into that stuff, which this movie does too. It leans a little bit less hard on that, and I think probably for the best. But yeah, I mean, we'll get into it. The opening of this film's brilliant. I've forgotten what a great action-packed kind of opening this film has. With this journalist Fred Hale, who's published this story, being hunted down by Pinky and his goons through Brighton, where we sort of meet all of the main players for the movie, and we get some great footage of 1940s Brighton, which I was so pleased to see, as they're sort of pursuing him through here. It was a 20-minute long sequence, like basically a quarter of the movie in its own way, and it's kind of, you meet this character, you kind of go with him this sort of limited amount of space, and then he's killed by Pinky. I mean, again, I hate to sound like this guy, but it's the sort of slightly asymmetrical structuring that movies tend not to bother with now. To spend a good deal of an already short movie on a character who's going to die and not going to be, the movie exists. The rest of the movie is the fallout from this one event.
Yeah.
And trying to sort of cover it up. And I don't know, I just think that's really, really interesting. And it's actually quite an exciting sequence. There's these big crowds, and we go onto the Brighton Pier. And if you've ever been to Brighton, if you've ever visited it for a day, you sort of know the basic geography of it, which is it has a train station up a hill, and you can see the sea from the train station, and you go down the train station to the front, and you walk along the promenade to the left, and you're at the pier. It's kind of, and the film uses that familiarity, so you actually have a sense of, direction with this action sequence of where he's going and what he's doing. I think that's really cool. There's a sign in the background of there's a big billboard that says, "Just add a little Bovril, gives the concentrated goodness of beef," which I was thankful for seeing.
Do you know the occult origins of Bovril?
The occult origins of Bovril, no.
Yeah, or at least the name. So it's this is not really relevant to the film.
I don't care. Tell me.
It's a portmanteau of bov for bovine, meaning cow-like, and vril, which is this sort of magic life force substance which appeared in an early science fiction novel called The Coming Race, which, as you might guess from the title, it foreshadows and is later incorporated into esoteric Nazism.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a strange deep cut, but Bovril is a horrible meat flavored tea, incidentally, for anybody who doesn't know. Which is that I was in a hospital once, quite poorly, and the guy who was recovering in the bed next to me, who was this Yorkshireman who looked like a molten waxwork manatee, he kept on drinking Bovril, and as a result, issued these absolutely unbelievable Bovril flavored farts. And to this day, I can't even look at the packaging of Bovril without feeling nauseous. So I didn't notice it in the film, but perhaps that was my subconscious trying to protect me.
Oh, that's excellent. I love Bovril. I think it's great. It's like a meat tea that you can keep in a jar. It keeps forever. It's great. Anyway, yeah. So we have this opening sequence where we meet our players. We meet Ida Arnold, who's played by she's called Hermione Baddeley. She's kind of an interesting character. What did you make of Ida in this movie?
I thought she was fantastic. I mean, it's almost a comic performance, like something out of Carry On films. But I would very happily watch Ida investigates an ongoing police sort of procedural drama in which she solves crimes. She's really interesting, I think, because there's a sort of tension in this film about how it presents the squalor of reality, and I think this comes down to something to like Graham Greene's own sort of sniffiness. Religious infused sniffiness about the fallen nature of man, etc. And he presents Brighton as being quite squalid, or intends it to appear quite squalid. And so he has this character of Ida who's, quite not a high class character, who is quite uncultured and loud and brash. But she is also like the force of good in the film and sort of indomitable figure. And it's not quite clear how you're meant to perceive this and Brighton and her class of people, because there's a sort of level of disgust and disdain in the film, which is then not entirely supported by the actions of that character, who is quite good natured. And obviously, if you choose to disdain these people, then you are also siding with Pinky, and who is a nihilistic figure who hates everything and the world in which he inhabits. Why? What was your take on Ida?
Yeah, I don't know. She's interesting. She's certainly an interesting spin on the occult detective trope. Kind of a proto. John, is he called Hellraiser? That guy? Is that? Have I got that?
Oh,
name
right.
right?
Yeah. John Constantine.
John Constantine. Yeah, John Constantine.
Well, she's not really magical. It should be
no.
out,
Well, she does a bit of She does her investigation kicks off with some automatic writing.
Board.
Yeah. Ouija board. Yeah, no, she's interesting. The first thing that happens in the movie is that she's singing in a pub, and Spicer, not Spicer, sorry, Pinky, tells her to shut up. This kind of sets them up in opposition right at the beginning of the movie. Yeah, it's a funny film really, because it makes its business, Pinky trying to kind of cover up for this crime he's committed, which I like, because often in gangster movies someone's offed and they just sort of lied over how that plays out. I like that there's a murder at the start of this movie. It's likely the first murder that Pinky's ever committed. He's going to commit at least one more in this movie, but I like that act of violence is given real weight, and the fact that Ida is this presence who is a decent person, is a very human person, although not a religious person, and that she has had this like passing interaction with this guy who she just kind of liked something about, this journalist. There was something in him that she saw that she liked, and she takes it upon herself to kind of fight for him and fight for the memory of him. And I don't know, that's that's how things should be done, isn't it? That should be what happens when people die for awful, meaningless reasons. And so it's nice to have that have a kind of a character in the movie who cares about that.
I think it's important that like the misanthropy of the film is a projection of Pinky's misanthropy, right? It's important that the extreme disgust which Pinky feels towards the world is really and accurately framed as being his problem. He sort of brings his own hell with him, and the fact that this force for good could exist in the same low fallen world and yet be completely uncorrupted by it really is the thing that sort of shows you that Pinky's own nihilism is a mistake, I think.
Yes, I guess it's tricky because it's hard. It's I guess why I asked her what you thought of her was that it's hard not to feel like she is a patronizing characterization of
Hmm.
working class people, I guess. And Graham Greene was certainly not above those kind of things. And it's just that his contempt for her is outstripped by his contempt for Pinky, and I think he was very down on pop culture generally. Um, and by pop culture, I mean teenage gangsters, um,
Yeah.
teenagers in general. I don't know. It's interesting. It's a down and dirty feeling movie, and it generally doesn't feel patronizing. It feels kind of quite real and
Hmm.
realistic, I think. But it is interesting that Ida, the character who is our investigator, essentially, is the one who rings a little bit false to me, even though she's a lot of fun to watch, and
Hmm.
dressing up, solving crimes while dressed up as a kind of vaudeville music hall clown. I'm
Right.
always going to be in for that. Um,
Well, it's interesting. I was just about to use the word clown in a different context. I was going to say that, like, whilst Pinky is this sort of demonic, nihilistic, misogynistic, yet also asexual figure. In fact, he spurns all kinds of human pleasure, basically, in his pursuit of absolute hatred. I mean, you would think that he is, and the film sets him up to be this creature of absolute menace, but like, he is actually himself just a total clown. Like, he is a child pretending to be a man, and he inherits this responsibility for this criminal gang, but he has absolutely he messes it up at the very first moment and then continues to make bad decisions throughout because of his level of inexperience. uh,
I love that at the moment he's committed the very first crime, he goes out onto the gun range on the pier and asks the guy what the time is. And the guy says, "I'm not going to give you an alibi for what time." He
right,
gets him
yeah.
immediately.
Well, this is it.
Um,
Apart from the people he can directly, like, cow or kill,
yeah.
like, the universe in general is absolutely not convinced by Pinky. Like,
Yeah, he's very interesting in that way, because he is. When you said that, just before we were talking, that he is kind of really incompetent and gets everything wrong. I hadn't considered that before, but it is true, and I guess it reminded me of what gangsters often kind of are, really, which is just people who are more willing to be awful than other people.
mm,
Like, he has risen to the top because he is capable of acts of horrific violence, which really shouldn't be a qualification for anything, except in this world where he is, on the up and up. Um, but he doesn't really have any skill or worth as a human being. He's just, he's just this kind of force of nature. Um, and yeah, I was to move on a little bit. I was really pleased with the weird, like, the colleague kibber cards. Like, this is like a promotional thing, which apparently was a real thing back in the day, where this journalist is going to be leaving these cards throughout Brighton in this certain time period, and you get 10 bob if you find one. And one of them is picked up by our sort of heroine for this, not heroine, sorry, but the kind of woman in this movie, who is Rose Brown, played by Carol Marsh. Now, um, she is a fascinating character. She's probably the most nuanced character in the movie, I think. As presented, she's very weak-willed. She falls under Pinky's thrall almost immediately, and her devotion to him is kind of slavish and intense from start to finish, basically. And she sort of withstands his ill treatment of her, only strengthens her feelings towards him. But despite all this, she, to me, feels like a much more realistic and easy to empathize character than Joan Fontaine and Rebecca. Um, what do you think about Rose, Marsh?
I think, yeah, she is sympathetic. I think it is primarily a result of how obviously young and unschooled in the world she is. Whereas I think in maybe Rebecca, that sort of wide-eyed naivety feels more like a crutch. Whereas here, this it is frustrating to see Rose go down these paths with Pinky, but it's kind of plausible that somebody, is she 17? I think she's 17.
Yes, I
Um,
think that's right.
somebody of that level of inexperience, in the first flush of true love for somebody, would make all of the bad decisions that she does. And she's not necessarily a creature given to great deep thought or introspection. You wouldn't want to call her stupid, but like, I don't think there's any pretense that she is necessarily capable of identifying Pinky's designs. I don't think it would never occur to her, and that's the thing. Sort of the tragic through line of it is her complete and utter belief in Pinky and his goodness, which is emphasized by the fact that at one point she asks him to sort of record on a gramophone record, which is an amusement arcade attraction, to go into a booth and record something onto a gramophone record, which you can then keep. She asks him to sort of record his devotion to her, and he goes into this booth and says a lot of very unpleasant things, and she holds on to that record in the utter belief that it is what she thinks it is, that it's his message of devotion to her. And do you want to get to the ending of the film straight away?
Well, we can hold on for a moment, I think.
Okay.
But yes, the recording he makes is, what you want me to say is I love you. Well, here's the truth. I hate you, you little slut. You make me sick. Which, wow. And that scene is framed with her like staring through the glass as he records this, like staring happily through as he says these horrible things about it. It's really quite chilling. I mean, it's we can move towards the end quite quickly, I think, because it is a movie that kind of, it gets into kind of the sort of violent way in which Pinky is trying to sort of cover his tracks. And the violence in this movie is genuinely shocking to my eyes. All of that face slashing with razor blades is really fucking nasty. And Pinky himself gets his face slashed and gets his scar. The movie was called Young Scarface in America. And there's this one particular scene I want to talk about, which is, I think at the time was notorious, which is when Pinky wants to kill Spicer. So Spicer is the kind of the one who properly messed up and put the token down in the place where Rose worked and was seen by him. So Pinky's been trying to get Spicer killed, and has had his own face slashed up in trying to do that. And it's got this fantastic sequence with in this kind of grotty house where they all live, which is basically Pinky pushing Spicer down the stairs. And it's really harrowing because he does this thing. It's beautifully staged. He walks out of the room. He goes over to the banister. He pushes it to confirm that it is, going to break. And then Spicer comes out of the room, and Pinky basically sort of backs him into this banister. He's trying to sort of get out of the life of crime, I guess. And Pinky goes to shake his hand, and then pushes him over the banister. And it's a really brutal fall. He crashes through the banister. He smashes a light on his way down, which, because it's a gas light, starts sort of firing flames out. And you actually see the moment of impact as he hits on the bottom floor, whack his face onto the wooden floor. It's really kind of shocking violence for 1948. It's just a really unnerving scene that is shot with, quite frankly, Hitchcockian sort of taste and tension and release. Yeah, so we kind of, by the by, Pinky tries and fails to sort of elude capture. Ida is kind of trying to track him down and stop him. And as things go on, as we were saying, it kind of all works out okay for Pinky. He gets away with it. And Ida is kind of, trying to appeal to Rose's sort of better judgment to kind of see what Pinky really is, but she just, the more debased Pinky becomes with her, the more she just seems to be drawn to him. And the denouement of the movie is interesting because like I say, Pinky kind of gets away with everything. But before he realizes he's going to get away with it, he's decided he's going to kill Rose, and we get into this kind of final sequence of the movie, with Pinky and Rose going for a walk, and he's trying to induce her to commit suicide. And she's torn between her love for Pinky and the Catholic prohibition against suicide, and hesitates. What did you make of this final sequence, Marsh?
Well, it's interesting to compare with Danvers' attempts to coax the protagonist of Rebecca into committing suicide, isn't it? That it's much more about not Rose's own worthlessness, which it is in the case of the Rebecca protagonist, but in terms of Rose's, it's playing on Rose's adoration of Pinky, like, you wouldn't want me to die alone, would you, sort of thing. It's not a very convincing argument, as far as I can tell.
We're gonna do a suicide pact. You first.
Yeah,
which is
right.
Almost like an old joke, Yeah, it's. I think one of the reasons that Rose is a bit more of a plausible character in this movie is that she does feel like a child. I think she does feel like a little girl, and I think that draws our sympathies, in a certain way, because she is being kind of complete. She doesn't really have a chance against him. She's completely dominated by him, and her Catholicism has set her up for kind of, she does hesitate, but then she's in for it. She's like, well, we're not going to heaven. Let's go to hell together, and it's like kind of a hell of a way to go. And then Pinky's lieutenant Dallow and Ida, realizing what he's going to do, they turn up, and a bunch of cops turn up, and Pinky throws himself off the pier to his death.
Is Brighton Pier really that high that if you fell
No.
off it you'd die?
No.
I didn't think so.
You'd be fine. But he really screams, and they make a job of throwing one of those Monty Python dummies down into the sea, where it lands and breaks very unconvincingly on the ways below. But no, you can easily jump from Brighton Pier, and in fact, people do jump from Brighton Pier quite a lot. Either way, you kind of need that moment. And then, this last scene. What a last scene this is. It kind of.
God,
Would you like to conjure this last scene, Marsh?
I don't, it's so distressing. I genuinely find it distressing. So the record that Pinky has made previously is still in Rose's possession. However, at one point, it's thought that Rose is going to play it, and this will obviously blow up their relationship, and thus Rose's reason to be his alibi. So he tries to destroy the disc by smashing it, but he only succeeds in scratching it, perhaps irreparably, perhaps not. But it still remains in her possession, and after he's died and she has been taken into care seemingly by nuns, she the nuns trying to convince her that Pinky was no good for her and this is for the best, and Rose is adamant that he loved her and his love was true, and she plays the gramophone, and instead of playing the whole message of his absolute hatred for her, it says, what you want me to say is I love you, and then it skips on the word I love you over and over again, perhaps indefinitely. And she is confirmed in her belief, her terrible belief, that Pinky was good and true and loved her. And there is, at the same time as Rose is such a fragile creature and so innocent that you don't want her to be disabused, that's a terrible notion to believe that somebody as demonic as Pinky could really have been her true love. Like, it's such an awful kindness. It's what is there's a phrase at the end of the film, like the appalling strangeness of the mercy of God.
Yes.
And it's just that's what it is. It is an act of mercy that she's not found the truth out, but it is also appalling at the same time.
Yes, and
Jesus
the camera,
Christ.
Yeah, well, I mean, Jesus Christ, the camera passes over her and goes to a crucifix with Jesus on it on the wall, and the end appears with bisected by a crucifix with Jesus on it. I mean, it's funny. I think the book has a more positive ending for Rose, and I think Graham Greene wrote this new ending. He wanted to kind of do a sort of, I guess he wanted to protect her in a funny kind of way, protect that faith she has, rather than having her sort of move on and get on with her life. And it did strike me as a kind of pretty, one of the things that's crap about religion, really. One of the things that's worst about Christianity is this impossible standard it sets you. It asks you to aspire to, Jesus. Be like this guy, be like Jesus. What would Jesus do? But then Jesus is, made of God dust. And so you can't ever be that good. All you can ever be is a failure. All you can ever be is damned. And, that's the kind of, that vibe is what Pinky sort of plays on, that kind of nihilism, that sort of sense of like, well,
Well, he believes in hell, but he importantly says that he doesn't necessarily believe in heaven.
That's right.
Like he exists already in a state of damnation, and the only other kind of afterlife he can imagine are further levels of damnation. It's pretty bleak. I think it's interesting because the two films. Rebecca isn't notably a particularly religious film, but I do think that like both films turn the physical locations in which they're set into places of psychological, metaphysical torment in a way. Like Manderley is haunted, if not in a literal sense, then certainly in every other way. Like so much so that when Rebecca's will is overturned, the mansion has no choice but to explode in flame.
It's full blown fall of the House of Ushers.
Right, and then Danvers' devotion is almost religious, and her look of ecstasy as she's consumed by the flames, like that. I think there's something distinctly and intentionally diabolical about that. And Brighton Rock obviously is much more in connection with it. Sort of this discussion of Catholicism. This place is like already hell, at least to Pinky.
Yes, and the character literally quotes from Mephistopheles in Dr. Faustus. He said, "Why, this is hell, nor am I out of it."
But all these characters are haunting themselves. That's the thing. I feel like Pinky's hell is the reality that he makes. There's that this Emily Dickinson poem, which I'm going to wankily recite to you. But one need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a house. The brain has corridors surpassing material place. I don't remember the rest, but it's basically like she goes on to say, "Oh yeah, it's far safer to walk through a spooky abbey at midnight than it is to encounter oneself alone." And I feel like Pinky is just this. It is in conversation with Catholicism, but all of the kind of the hellishness of that reality is a result of Pinky and his outlook on the world.
He says, "When I was a kid, I'd swore I'd be a priest."
Well, he is. Yeah, he's just working for the other side.
Yeah. There's another bit I really liked, actually, which I forgot to mention, which is there's this scene where Rose wants to give Pinky someone, so she writes him this love letter of slavish devotion, and you can hear from outside the window a baby crying, a baby like screaming and crying. And it just goes over the scene until she leaves, and then he goes and slams the window shut. And I just love that. I love that touch of like, are we just sort of doing a sort of original sin greatest hits of a kind of, baby born out of wedlock, assumedly just screaming through the window. And I love that. It's just such a kind of, simple but effective thing. And that ending with that kind of I love you, the devotion to recitation, the devotion to, simplicity repeated ad infinitum. It's very, I don't know, like a lot of Graham Greene stuff. It kind of it comes from a place of belief, but it also, well, it actually doesn't come from a place of belief. It comes from a place of agnosticism, which was where he eventually ended up. Greene,
really?
Yeah, I think so. I think he described himself as a Catholic agnostic, ultimately. Huh. But I think his books were always, they engaged with the trouble of religion in a kind of contrast to C.S. Lewis, which can, sort of disregarded that. I think Greene very much wanted to, wrestle with these things, and not be and wrestle with the dogma of them, rather than accepting them. I think that's he was at his most interesting when he was, treading those hallways. So yeah, that was Brighton Rock. I mean, they remade it, didn't they? With in the kind of 10 years or so ago.
I did not see the remake.
Yeah, they sort of set it in mod times, which is, I don't know, it's weird. Like, sort of going to mash up that movie with Quadrophenia is kind of a strange idea. But I quite like to see how they do that opening sequence. Actually, I was just thinking that maybe I'll have a look at the beginning there. But no, it does certainly feel like a movie that's of its time, and that interwar vibe gives it a good feel. And also just the fact that these are, like, the way it's staged, like, these are all these, is the word they use, spiv, is that right? These gangsters, these kids, and they're a kind of mixture of kids and old men. It kind of, and the way that they move through these crowds and stuff like that, I like that, because I've been to Brighton, relatively recently, before the pandemic, I think, on a big crowded day out, and it's the horror of these kind of horrible guys, smoking and edging around, and it's just a really identifiable, kind of locale to put these awful people in.
Yeah.
I'd also, that pub, I really want to go to that pub.
Oh yeah. I don't know if that was meant to be alluring, but it really,
well, I mean, it's
made
gross,
my mouth
but
water.
I still want to go there. I want to go to that pub. I haven't smoked in years, but I want to go to that pub and have a bass and smoke a few fags. But probably for the best, I can't.
I really enjoyed watching these two movies with you, Jamie. They were really interesting to pair together.
Delightful to go through them with you.
That's all the time we have for this lock-in. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here, as they say, because I'm about to overturn a candelabra and set the entire place alight. But you can send us questions to questions at Crate and Crowbar, or you can tweet us at Crate and Crowbar. You can listen to these recordings as videos on YouTube, where you can find other nonsense by us. The address for that is youtube.com/Crate and Crowbar. Thanks as always to our backers on Patreon. These lock-in podcasts are actually free, entirely free, but you can support our mainline gaming podcast at patreon.com/Crate and Crowbar, or you can join our lovely Discord community. They are a great bunch of people. The link for which is on our website, crateandcrowbar.com. That's it. I've been Marsh Davis.
And I've been Jamie Britton.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Everybody.
Everybody. There you go.